Well, let's talk about Ukraine now, because things are happening, especially on the financial front. The $40 billion aid package that the US Senate has approved to send to the country is the largest aid package since Russia began its invasion on the 24th of February. US President Joe Biden applauded members of the Senate for sending, and I quote, a clear bipartisan message to the world that the people of the United States stand together with the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their democracy and freedom. Biden said the resources he requested will allow the US to send more weapons and ammunition to Ukraine to replenish its own stockpile and support US troops stationed on NATO territory. Let's talk to General Jack Keane, a retired four-star general and former Vice Chief of Staff to the US Army. General, good evening to you.
Yeah, good evening. Great to be talking to you.
Right, yeah, good to be talking to you too. I'm just looking at the response of President Zelensky, and he says $40 billion is a significant contribution to the restoration of peace and security in Ukraine, Europe, and the world. And you can see why he might say that. But what about the bipartisan nature of the support here? Apart, I think, from Rand Paul, the maverick Republican senator, people were on board with this pretty much from the get-go, weren't they?
Yeah, it was an overwhelming bipartisan support. I don't think there were any Democrats who voted against it, and there were some Republicans who did. You know, if you added up both houses, Senate and the House, that would total about 67 Republicans voted against it. Some because they just don't want any more spending on the Republican side, and some others in the Republican Party are what we would describe as isolationists. I'm not using that word in a negative fashion, but that's what they really represent, and they just don't want to be involved. But yeah, it's an overwhelming support that really represents where the American people are, that want to help Ukraine.
Yeah, but what about the political and military calculations behind this? You know, it's one thing to be seen to be supporting, quotes, freedom and democracy and around the world, but it's another thing when you consider how many times Russia has warned the US and its NATO allies not to get too deeply involved.
Well, I think we have to be involved. I mean, certainly Putin is trying to remake the Russian Empire, and he certainly has advertised very clearly his design on Ukraine and taking control of it, likely Moldova as well. And also, he has threatened the former Soviet republics who are now part of NATO as well. So here's the opportunity in Ukraine to stop that from happening. Literally, if Russia is successful here and is able to do what they intend to do, then Moldova will be next, and he would likely use that success and the power that's coming from it to do what he's always wanted to do, and that is break the transatlantic alliance and NATO. So
do you really think, General, he would do that, given how difficult he's found trying to destroy or even pacify Ukraine, the number of men he's lost, the amount of equipment, the fact that he's now having to micromanage at the level of some, colonel? Would he really have the stomach to try again in another country?
Well, why wouldn't he? I mean, I take him at
well, because of how difficult this has been.
Are you going to let me talk or what?
Sure, go.
Well, thank you. Look, if he's able to achieve what he wants in Ukraine, that is just going to encourage him even further, and he would see that as a defeat for the United States and NATO. That is exactly how he's going to advertise it, and believe me, it would be a defeat for the United States and NATO as well. And certainly, I mean, it wouldn't do it initially, but it would empower him more than where he is right now, certainly as an international pariah, and encourage him over time to encroach further. What we want to do is deter him from encroaching further, and we have an opportunity to crush the Russian military inside Ukraine. And I can't think of any better deterrence for the United States and NATO than to do that. That would set him back for years and likely dissuade him from completely from conducting another military invasion of a NATO country, certainly.
Can we spend a moment just talking about the package that the Pentagon spokesman John Kirby outlined during his press briefing? So we're talking about 18 155 millimeter howitzers, 18 tactical vehicles to tow the howitzers, 3 AN/TPQ 36 counter artillery radars, and field equipment and spare parts. I'm not a military guy. I suspect a lot of the people listening to us are not military specialists, but you are. What could the Ukrainians do with that equipment?
Well, we have already given them 90 artillery howitzers before this, so it's pretty significant. What is actually happening here in the war? It's much of an artillery war. The Russians have always had good artillery going back to their Soviet days, but their ground maneuver forces in the Ukraine fight are just not up to the task. When the Ukrainians approach them, or when the artillery is put on them, they have a tendency to stop moving forward, or indeed retreat. And so what we need to do is stop their artillery, which is very significant. They have more of it, and they have longer range. So what kills artillery is artillery. Mm-hmm. When you have the radar that picks up the enemy's artillery, and you can very quickly return fire from which that came. Air power also kills artillery. And the drones that we're giving the Ukrainians also have that capability to do that. So, yeah, this is something that Zelensky asked for almost at the beginning. The fact is, United States and NATO were slow in responding to him, I think, until it was obvious that he had turned the tide against the Russians, and the genocide and the atrocities came, and the world was horrified by that. And I think the support for Ukraine just tripled in terms of the emotional support from them, but also the material support.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of this report that Russia has fired senior commanders for their poor performance during the invasion amid an emerging culture of cover-ups and scapegoating?
Yeah, well, I think their generals have just been fundamentally inept. They could not put together a campaign plan that makes any sense based on the limitations that their forces have. The campaign in the beginning to take the control of the entire countries on 4 different major axes, all requiring their own logistic support and also their own air power. That was so ambitious and so complicated. I know we in the United States and people who have done campaign planning like that obviously to include myself, that would be demanding for us. But it was impossible for them. And even now, down in the Donbass region where they're conducting attacks there, another set of generals have planned a terrible campaign. They're attacking on 4 different axes, again, in a much smaller area, not supporting each other, no main effort to figure out where the penetration should be made and then to exploit it. They don't use the fundamentals of campaign planning and how to overwhelm an enemy. It is really surprising, to be frank about it.
Mm-hmm. But one thing they have done successfully, General, is blocking Ukrainian ports, stopping grain and other produce leaving Ukraine, the so-called breadbasket of Europe. I'm just looking at a story on the front page of tomorrow morning's Daily Telegraph, big newspaper here, and the headline is U.S. missiles could end Russian food blockade, and they say that sea-skimming, Harpoon and naval strike missiles could be dispatched either directly or by European allies equipped with them. This is to end the blockade because it would appear the tactic is to try and make poor countries starve from hunger without the grain.
Well, you put your finger on a major, major issue, and it's sort of the Achilles heel of what is happening to the Ukrainians, because they've had a lot of success, but the Russians also own the southern coast, and therefore the Sea of Azov is cut off. Their ports are under the control of the Russians, while Odessa, which is a major port in the Black Sea, in the western part of Ukraine, is under the control of the Ukrainians. The Russians have blockaded any of the cargo ships from getting in or getting out. 95% of Ukraine's grain and corn, which is exported to the international community, passes through those seaports, and it's not happening. That is devastating for Ukraine and also will cause global food shortages. The UN is trying to work some kind of relief operation so the cargo ships can get through. I've recommended the Pentagon to at least consider using the United States and NATO fleets to come back into the Black Sea. They left prior to the invasion, and escort cargo ships in and out, always staying in international waters. They have to do some demining because some of that has to be cleared out. And I would recommend that if the UN isn't able to do it without having to have maritime shipping. That will provoke Putin for sure. He'll start threatening us for sure. But, I mean, given what is happening here, and you put your finger on something that's very serious, not just for the devastation inside of Ukraine, but what's going to happen on the global food market and the shortages that's going to incur.
Absolutely. A lot of vulnerable countries there, perhaps one of them being Afghanistan, a country you know well. Did we know when the Taliban took over, after the US and others pulled out, rapidly in August? Did you have any hope that they were a different Taliban, that they would be a more diverse Taliban, that they would embrace some freedoms at least? Because I'm just looking at this development today in which they've told female television presenters that it's not enough to wear the hijab, they've also got to wear the niqab. Have you seen this?
No, I had no illusions about who they are. I can't tell you how many times I've been in Afghanistan, assisting our generals, assisting Dave Petraeus, Stan McChrystal, and others who were the commanders there. And I was all over the country, down at the lowest level of tactical fighting, particularly during the Afghan surge. I saw the Taliban up close and how brutal and fanatical they were and how they controlled villages and towns and neighborhoods and cities, and their fanaticism and the imposition that they cause people. I mean, the people under Taliban rule are so repressed, and they deny their people any sense of education. It's mostly about radical fundamentalism. Obviously, women don't get educated, but even their males don't get a decent degree of education. There's no future for the young people under this fanatical rule. No illusions there. They are who they are.
Surely they must understand that for any country to develop in the 21st century, there has to be education of the vast majority of the population. There have to be a degree of economic and political freedom, because all the successful countries in the world, pretty much, that's what they've embraced.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the thing that started to move the United States, prior to post-World War One, and start to move the United States because it had industrial capacity, is when we mandated high school education for everybody. That was a major factor in turning America into a much more productive and valuable society. Certainly education is the thing, where the Taliban do not embrace that. It's all about their radical fundamentalism, and they will fail over time. There's no doubt in my mind about it. They'll collapse and implode, likely economically, as a result of how they run their country. There'll be no technological advance in their country, and certainly no cultural advance to speak of, other than what they embrace with their own radical version of Islam.
What prospect of some kind of insurgency against the Taliban, not from ISIS-K, but from people from the former government that you know well, some defense and military specialists? Because I hear rumors and rumblings and reports that they are preparing for something.
Yeah, there's no doubt that will happen. It'll take some time to get organized, but yes, that will take place, as it did before. The Taliban, as our audience knows, did rule Afghanistan in the 90s, and the northern tribes conducted an insurgency against them, and that was ongoing when al-Qaeda conducted its 9/11 operation against the United States. And, of course, we came in on the side of the Northern Alliance and provided them special forces on the ground with them and air power to do in the Taliban and take over the regime. So, yeah, there was a full-throated insurgency against them that was ongoing, and that will likely manifest itself again. It's inescapable.
Well, let's wait and see what happens. General Jack Keane, retired four-star general and former Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Times Radio.